we're going to do today is Fusion. So if you're on a PC, some of these steps initially are going to be slightly different, but I don't think you'll have any trouble finding out how to get to the point where we begin the install. So you may have to do a little bit of homework to get to that point. Okay, so let's begin. If you see down here, we do have about 50 gigs free of hard disk space, so we should be good to go. Oh no, I'm sorry, that's actually set for CentOS, and then we've got 10 megs specified for Windows 8. Don't know what's going on there. Anyways, so let's go ahead and hit add. And what we're going to do, we have some options here. We can import, we can migrate from, another PC or from our boot camp partition, which can be very, very cool. But in our case, we're just going to select new. So go ahead and do that. And now at this point it's saying, okay, we can do this. How do you want me to go about this? Obviously, since I'm using one of the brand new MacBooks with Retina, the mighty Apple has decided that DVD drives are, no longer essential. So whether you want to agree with that or not is beyond the scope of this video introduction. However, we don't have a DVD player. So this is why I have an ISO pre-downloaded and ready to go for us. But if you do have a disk rather than an ISO, that's no problem. My guess is that your software will automatically recognize that you have a DVD in, and probably even see that it's ready to go as a Windows image. So some of you may have that from your textbook, which includes a trial 180-day version of Windows 2008. And if that's the case, it'll probably just work right away. Okay, so what we're going to do is tell Fusion, hey, this is no problem. We don't have a disk in. We're going to specify an ISO later, so we're just going to say continue without disk. Okay. Now at this point we've got a couple different options. We can specify a disk or an image, and remember this ISO, I haven't mentioned this, but ISO essentially means this is a disk image. Okay, so we can use this, and this is the option we're going to choose. However, there are some other options as well. We could add to an existing disk. Now this is not relevant for us for what we're doing today, so I'm going to skip by this. Or we could create a new custom virtual machine, custom. And again, what we're going to do today, we're not going to discuss the other two options at this point. We may have another video series on this, but for us today, we're going to go ahead and use our first option. So obviously, what we need to do is choose which image we're going to go with. So I'm going to select it, and I'm going to say where it is. So as we know, it's here on my desktop, and here we go, and we're going to simply hit open here, and here we are. We're ready to go. So in this case, we have English server, Windows 2008, so on and so forth. See the big long name, and it does match up to what's here on my desktop, so we're good to go. So let's go ahead and hit continue. Now notice that it is smart enough to look at either the file name or the data inside, and it recognizes that it's Windows, and it's Windows Server 2008 R2 64-bit edition, which is exactly what we need. Now what this is important for is simply some of the initial install steps, but you don't necessarily have to have this pitch perfect. Do notice that we do have some other options here depending on what it is, so just be aware of this. But if you're using something just off FreeBSD or something like that and don't see it, don't panic. You should be still okay on an install. Okay, notice that we do have some other options here in case it read the disk incorrectly, but for us it was correct. So we're going to go ahead and keep that as our default option too. So if yours is not correct, you may need to set that as you need. Okay, now at this point we have some options. The easy install is nice because it takes away some of the initial options that just saves us some time. Kind of start it, walk away, come back, and does some things easier for you. However, we're not going to go that route. We're not going to use the easy install. We want to kind of go through custom and make sure everything is selected exactly the way that we want it. Also, I'm not obviously going to enter in a product key on this video, which makes obvious sense. So let's go ahead and hit continue. Now at this point it's basically saying, okay, listen, here's how we're going to do this. We are going to install Windows Server 2008, and we're going to allocate 2 gigs of memory. Now for us, for what we're doing as a video introduction, that is sufficient. You do need to be aware of how much memory your computer currently has. This machine, I believe, is running, let's say 8 gigs, I think. So 2 gigs should be more than sufficient, not only to run the operating system, but also not to tie down the resources on my machine as well. And so, if you're running a machine with, a host desktop with 4 gigs of memory, you might want to bump this down to 1 gig. If you run 16 gigs, and you might have the ability and availability to go from, instead of 2 gigs, maybe assign 4 gigs to it. But it also depends on how you're going to be using this operating system. Keep in mind, for this video, we're just simply installing Windows Server 2008, and in the future, if I use this image for further demonstrations, I'm not going to really tax this machine out. So to me, 2 gigs is enough. Really, same rule of thought, same logic goes with disk size. 40 gigs is enough for me. Now, if you're going to be virtualizing a machine, you're going to actually be using it in the enterprise, and it's going to become some kind of file server, something like that. It may need to be quite bigger than 40 gigs. So you need to make that call as well. Again, for me, this works. Now, networking. We've got shared networking, NAT for network address translation. Now, I'm not going to talk about that much in this video because it's not quite important, but I will have some more video series coming out that will detail all the differences between the networking types that we can select. And then notice for the CD/DVD, basically we're using this ISO. It says CD/DVD. Don't let that bother you. We are using this image that you see right here, but for all intents and purposes, it lists here, and this is the source that it's going to install from. Now, if you did want to customize, you can select here and do a couple things. One, we can choose exactly where we want to install to. I'm going to go ahead and put it under my documents under virtual machine, so it'll go right where CentOS and Windows 8 are, which makes a lot of sense for quite obvious reasons. And now let's go ahead and hit finish. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and, I guess, do what we did earlier, which I just brought up, and say, yep, the name is fine, looks good to me. So we hit save. And now what it's going to go ahead and do is bring everything up. So watch this. At this point now, because we are virtualizing, look at this. It looks almost, for those of you that may have installed Windows before, it almost looks, with the exception of all this desktop cut away, it looks as if we just turned a computer on with a disk in. It's reading right off the disk and getting ready to go. And really, largely, that is true. That's essentially what we've got going on here. So we can go ahead and wait. And what's happening right now is you can see this is running inside of inside of VMware Fusion. And so really this software that's running in here really has no idea that it's being virtualized. It does not know, this install right here does not know it's actually part of a larger operating system. And the reason for that is because VMware Fusion, again, is virtualizing all of the instances of my physical hardware and delivering it to this desktop, or I shouldn't say this desktop, I should say this server, as if it is its own individual hardware. Okay, so that's really what allows me to do this. And actually, we can even hold over some of these things and see some of the hardware that's being used. It's virtualizing my hard disk as a SCSI drive, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to go over all of these because it's really not too important at this point. Okay, so here we go. We're ready to go. We're ready to begin the install. Now, just for your sake and mine, I'm going to go ahead and choose. I'm going to go ahead and full screen this. Okay, so this will just let us it sees everything a little bit bigger and easier for you to see probably on the video as well. So we're going to go ahead and select our English US options. If you're watching this from another country, you need to change that. Go ahead and do that as you need. Now, one thing I always like to do, I do like to point out to my students. Look at this down here, this repair your computer. Sometimes this is very, very, very useful. Now, there are other ways that you can get to your repair partition or system partition to go ahead and change some settings. But this is one way that you can get right in. Now, we're not going to choose this right now, but I do make note that this is available right here, and this can be useful in the cases where your SAM file may get corrupted, perhaps your registry hive gets corrupted. I have had situations like that before. Maybe a user forgets, my students will occasionally forget their administrator password. So these are nice ways that you can go in and go into your repair partition and essentially run what I like to call just low-level commands to make changes to your operating system. And it's very, very powerful, a little bit more complicated, but you can do some powerful things to recover your machine if you run into some kind of catastrophic failure. All right, we're not going to choose that though, and we're not going to talk about that right now, although we may later. Go ahead and hit install now. And now it's going to go ahead and begin the installation. So notice it says setup is starting. It's going to go ahead and start querying my hardware, seeing what's out there. Keep in mind all of this is virtualized. And it also is going to go ahead and look on the ISO or the image and say, hey, what do we have available here? So notice what I want to point out to you, we have a lot of different versions. We have Windows 2008, R2 Standard. We have both full and server core. Same with Enterprise, same with Data Center, same with Web Server. Now, all of this is Windows Server 2008, R2, Release 2. The difference between each of these is, first of all, each edition. We have Standard, Enterprise, Data Center, and Web Server. Now, we don't have time in this lecture to go through each of these and what the differences are between these, but they are for different purposes. It makes sense that we're going to go ahead and use Standard today, but later on we'll talk about the differences between Standard, Enterprise, Data Center, and Web Server. You need to know the difference, especially when you're making purchasing decisions. There's no need to purchase Data Center Center, for example, and web server will do the trick for you. The second thing I want to make note of is full installation versus server core. Essentially what server core is a far more stripped down version of Windows. It's very akin to running a non-graphics version of Linux. In my opinion, Microsoft really took a smart decision here and kind of took a page out of Linux and Unix's book and saying, you know what, there are instances where we don't need a full-blown operating system. And there are many cases where a server core installation, which is essentially non-graphics and more stripped down, is more suitable as a replacement. And keep in mind the thoughts behind this are twofold. First of all, it's going to be faster. The less you have running, the faster it's going to operate. Secondly, a nice thing about server core is that it has, again, when we strip away a lot of the unnecessary things like graphics, essentially we're stripping away code. What do we know about code? The more code that exists